Hello and welcome to Liquid Worldings, Feminist and Ecomaterial Imaginaries of Water, a conversation series hosted by Contemporânea. This series attunes to water, its material agencies, storied flows, and political entanglements by engaging across its sessions with Latin American hydropoetics, hydroactivism, African feminist aquapoetics, material eco-critical approaches to the blue humanities, and the use of sound as a medium of research in aquatic contexts. These conversations explore how art, literature, and situated listening practices can open up transformative ways of sensing, knowing, and relating to water, enacting gestures of insurgent care and resistance. For this third session of the series, it's a pleasure to welcome Margarida Mendes, a researcher, curator, educator, whose work traverses ecological mediation, experimental cinema, sound studies, and the environmental humanities. She has long been engaged in anti-extractivist activism and eco-pedagogy, collaborating with marine NGOs, universities, and cultural institutions. She creates transdisciplinary forums, exhibitions, and experiential works where alternative modes of education and sensing practices may catalyze political imagination and restorative action. Margarida has participated in the curatorial teams of major international exhibitions, such as the 11th Liverpool Biennale and the 11th Guangzhou Biennale, and has co-directed several educational platforms such as Escuelita or The World in Which We Occur, Matter in Flux, and she also holds a PhD from Goldsmiths, University of London. In today's session, Margarida shares her sonic investigations in the Mississippi River, reflecting on sound as an investigative medium for tracing environmental transformations and attuning to evolutionary processes across geotemporal scales. Welcome, Margarida, and thank you for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Salomé. It's a pleasure to be here and share a part of my research, which is wide, and my neuroplasticity sometimes is difficult to summarize everything in one lecture only. So I'm going to focus on my case study of my PhD that I did research in the lower Mississippi River near New Orleans. And we're going to jump straight at it. But I'm first going to share my screen and give you a little bit of context. So you see my images now, yes?
Yes, perfect.
That's great. So maybe I should start by sharing that after doing a lot of activism on deep sea mining, I was extremely connected to the water column and discovering my way into ocean studies. And my PhD actually started on ocean noise, thinking about the dispossession of the sensorium of other than human species in a milieu that they cannot escape, which is the water column, where we know that sound travels 4 to 5 times faster than in atmosphere. So I was very, let's say, fascinated by the ecological conundrum of thinking about conservation in a space which is completely fluid, juridical boundaries in a place that destabilizes any notion of fixity, with sound and water being a kind of axiomatic space where I can think about these ecological complex systems. So water is not only a medium that I think through, and I have a collective that we work on river rights, and we do performative juridical walks and forums and co-creations with activist communities. So water becomes a space, but also a kind of a conceptual arena to think further some of the ontological constructs and some of the problematics around toxicity and coastal or intertidal systems, as I like to call them. So we're going to flash forward, skip the ocean noise, chapters, and the more kind of ontological opening of sound studies and sensory studies as a way into my practice, and going to jump straight in to a site which is highly industrialized and highly complex, which is the lower Mississippi River. So I started in the North Atlantic, And because I'm based in Portugal, which is a place that does not have so much industrial development on our coastal areas, I had the chance to have 2 travels to Louisiana in 2019 and thought, why not have these kind of contrasted spaces that have different coastal and riverine kind of context to think with and through sound about the different forms of dispossession around. So I'm taking you on a journey of these 2 trips, and I'm sharing some of my research methods. So it's going to be more oriented towards that and towards the experiments that I did in collaboration with conversations and with activists on the ground. And I'm going to elaborate on some of my field notes where I was thinking with and through water, with, in and through sound as a mode of knowing, and acoustomology, as Stephen Feld, anthropologist of sound, has coined, a way of knowing through sound. So here we are, the first image you can all see, right? This kind of submerged road. This is in the peninsula on maybe 1.5 hours south from New Orleans. It's by Cocodrie, and New Orleans stretches like as this kind of finger tentacle, like peninsulas that stretch towards the ocean. And in this area, people have gotten used to living with water and living in this kind of intertidal space that surrounds them. Their houses are built on stilts, so the high pillars, as you see on the background, sometimes 10 meters high stilts. And this kind of cohabitation in an always humid milieu is something that is ongoing on their day-to-day. So my first trip, I was kind of scanning and reading the landscape and really trying to connect with the forms of narrativizing water traumas in the area, being that I was there in 2019. You all know that Katrina was 2005, so there's a kind of 14-year leap. Also, we had the Horizon spill, which was also a marker in the kind of ecocide temporal line of the New Orleans greater region. And I was trying to learn some of these stories. So I'm going to just go with you through the images and share some of the thoughts and conversations I was having throughout. This is an image, for example, from one of the state museums. And I was quite fascinated how water narrations are done not only by state institutions, and we have to think that New Orleans had settler colonialism from Spanish, French, and different kind of occupations, but also there are other forms of narrating water stories that come from kind of autoethnographic museums that are held on people's like garages or backyards. And I was kind of curious on seeing like how orality is kind of narrating these different layers. As you see here in the image, we have a great difference from 2001 to 2005 of coastal erosion. And 2005, we know it's the year of Katrina, but we also know that coastal erosion is connected with the fact that with the increase of salinity, the roots of the vegetation that kind of hold the land and the sediments in this kind of far end of the peninsula, the salinity changes all these cycles, and sometimes the roots don't fix on the ground so easily. So the storm surges, they just flow straight into the continent. So coastal erosion has this cycle that is kind of the impending ongoing catastrophe of climate change, which is also changing how all the plants and the critters are adapting. So I was very interested in looking at also these narrations of how the critters in this kind of aquatic milieu are adapting and changing. So how there's a connection between evolution and engineering, and how this is actually being seen and read through the landscape. You have to think that my PhD is very infrastructural critic led. So my kind of investigative desire is to read space and infrastructure and its alterations through time. On this next image from 1944, we see a very famous map of the Mississippi River, which I don't know if you've encountered before. It became the kind of main image of the Anthropocene Project, which is a project that I was somehow invited to take part, run by the Haus der Kultur und der Welt in Berlin. And here we see this fantastic map by Harold Fisk, where we see the different routes of the Mississippi through time. And we see how a river meanders. It finds its course, it adapts, it has its memory, finds its valleys, and widens the possibilities of navigating through the landscape and opening different bridges on land. we also know that settler colonialism opposes exactly this kind of elemental derive and the elemental desire to find its own course. And New Orleans history is highly contested as well due to all the migrations that had happened and the settler colonialism that has displaced different communities that live there, such as the Homa Nation, which is represented in this map by Monique Verdun, an activist that I will introduce to you later, which is the map that speaks about the different migrations of the Homa Nation, like from the bayou, so the areas like closer to the periphery of the Gulf, up and down. So there's this kind of movements upriver, downriver, also all the maroon movements that have fled to the swamps, and all of these communities that have changed place and relocated as settler colonialism was kind of fixing where the river is. So I was very interested in this kind of the narration of fixity of the river, as Dilip de Kuinga, the Indian theorist, speaks about in his book about the invention of rivers, that he speaks there is no dryness, there's only different degrees of wetness. And he says that rivers are invented by the fixity of infrastructure that kind of tames their path. So in my journey through sound and around rivers, I also try to think about this kind of the permeable spaces in and around rivers and how the river expands in and through bodies, also along narration of toxicity, as I will introduce to you later. Here is Monique Verdun narrating in her studio the vast implementation of the petrochemical infrastructure, which you see in the green dots and red pipelines in the Gulf. It's totally overwhelming. And these are maps that are done by architectural studios together with activists, because not everything is, of course, transparent in a highly militarized space. So I was reaching the ground. I was trying to understand, okay, how are these aquatic cohabitations, being lived on the day-to-day by activists, but also how are we unveiling and uncovering these kind of petrohistories that have been in the Gulf for so long. I had to visit and go around different refineries to understand their soundscape, understand how they're placed in the landscape, their inaccessibility, and how they're imposed in the surrounding ecosystem. And then I was curious to also see how water has transformed the different forests in deep time. And this is, for example, an image from Bataria Nature Reserve, which is a swampy nature reserve. And we see the trees with the Spanish moth, which is kind of hanging from the trees in the background. And it's kind of swampy ecosystems that I am not so used to in Portugal. We have only very, very little swamps in some area. And I really had to dive deeper to understand how it's inhabiting in different wetlands, which I've been researching in different parts of the world for quite some time now. And I even took the official tourist boat to do the swamp tour and to understand how is the swamp actually narrated by those that tell its story, and how is kind of the orality of the swamp being traded from generation to generation and passed along. So this kind of transmission of information along with ecosystem preservation was something that was interesting to me, and to get into the ground, get into the field, and get to know it a little bit better on this first kind of mapping journey. This is another image just south from New Orleans. So this is the Mississippi, as you see, this brown water. And this is a normal day. This is a day where the flow is a little bit high, but on a normal flux. And we see that, these critters have already gotten used to cohabitate with the changing ecosystem. Same place, just down, we see the levee on the lower right side. So it's this dike or construction that protects the river from storming into land. And, a kind of cohabitation with infrastructural systems and the container harbor in the background, and all these kind of impending infrastructures that are already amphibian in some way. An interesting architect kind of raised a question when we had a conversation about the strip pumping stations, which are over 24 around New Orleans, and that work 24/7 with big engines to pump water from the city and to drain it. Otherwise, the city soil has subsidence, so it kind of sinks in. And he said that these pumping stations become somehow the pacemaker of the city itself, that if they were shut down for a couple of days, the city easily becomes a swamp. So there's this kind of reliance on these kind of pulsating systems that sustain, a city or a former settler space. And there's this kind of impending rhythm of the industrial flux and the river flux that have their own register, and that now become subsumed to the rhythms of contemporary cohabitation and industrialism and so forth. So because this is a highly industrialized area, I was looking into these rhythms and how they've been shaping the ecosystems and cohabitation around them. So we jumped to November. First trip was April, and here I am with some colleagues to do part of this river journey, which was part of the river semester, part of the Anthropocene curriculum project, Mississippi and Anthropocene River, held by HKV. The river semester was actually a teaching semester, and it started in Minnesota, so in the north of the states, where the Mississippi starts at a very narrow flux. And a couple of students and some other scientists, artists, and theorists traveled from the headwaters to New Orleans in different legs of a long journey. So over maybe 3 months, mostly on water, little bits by land with a supporting van. But this is the look of our gear as we went on this trip. So we were more or less 15, and we decide to have canoes, or they decide, and I'm just invited, because it's the most stable boat that can travel in the river without having any CO2 emissions. So we're 15, 3 canoes, we have all our gear, and we set camp every day. Every day we do maybe like 20 miles, something like that, or a little bit over. And we traveled from Baton Rouge to New Orleans. So I joined the trip on the last stretch of the trip. There were 6 legs of the trip. And from Baton Rouge to New Orleans, maybe like 190 miles. And so every day we did more or less 20, and we follow kind of a routine and a protocol for scientific research, which was very relaxed. There were like gender studies, teachers, people taking water samples. I was doing field recordings that I'll tell you later. And some people were shooting for a documentary. So it was a very kind of creative space where we kind of like feel the river by directly being immersed to it, by canoeing and having our strength being pulled by the kinetic force of the river. We kind of become attuned to its flow. And on the background, you see an image of our day-to-day, which is dozens of petrochemicals, large tankers, and both barges. So it's really kind of a highway for shipping different kind of goods, from coal, oil, soy, different forms of kind of refined petrol that becomes many, many, many other derivatives. And this is an image of our day starting to do research. So the technology that I took was a Zoom recorder with a hydrophone, so a microphone that listens underwater with a 15-meter cable, so it has a little bit of depth. And I could record below and above the waterline. So I was just kind of, mapping the site, listening to the site, and then playing it back to people and thinking about it. At the same time, I was taking a lot of field notes that became part of my texts and of different poetry that I composed and part of some installations. And I'm going to take you deeper on this journey to speak about some of the sonic reflections and aquatic reflections and how they kind of infuse each other as we canoed, and this kind of thought was being produced by my body on site, exposed to 24-hour noise, camping on a thin membrane with a tent around me that kind of, dissolved the boundaries with the atmosphere and everything I was hearing. So the dreams were becoming super intense, and I was being immersed in vibration the whole time. And that's something that was very strong and that kind of provoked the kind of more like embodied or feminist kind of methodologies that have been developed in my practice. This is our morning. Our morning, we got the map. We see the meandering Mississippi and little stretches, and we kind of mapped where we going mile by mile, what we encounter. We followed the River Gator, which is an online blog for different people that have been canoeing down the river, which is something that is done for decades and decades and decades as a kind of nature practice and also kind of a DIY tourism practice. So we kind of follow some kind of helpers and guidelines because, as you imagine, in a place where just from the stretch from Baton Rouge to New Orleans, these 190 miles, used to have 400 plantations, which have now been replaced by 200 refineries and carceral institutions. So this place is, of course, heavily militarized and securitized. So we had to somehow adapt and embody the character of the river rat, so the one that's kind of hides and seeks and goes around it. And the only place we could camp is on sediment banks or on islands. So we actually don't have license to go on shore unless somebody offers the place outside the levee and there's a farm, which is very rare. So we actually had to occupy different stretches of land to be able to survive. And every day we kind of stretch the map, we prepare our gear, and we went to the field, everybody with their own purpose and research. And we also opened this, kind of manual where we had a list of the different petrochemical corridors. This is a very resumed list of the stretch we were going through, also with some of the chemicals that are being produced. And it was very difficult to digest. In the River Gator, we had very detailed information about, for example, nuclear waste being stored on open air and different kind of things that, I'm not sure they're all registered or regulated. And we somehow had to inhabit in these toxic lands. So my project, as I opted to go on this leg of the journey, it was the petrochemical corridor, also known as Cancer Alley or Death Alley, where sometimes the cancer rate around a particular factory is 600 times higher than in other areas of the States. I was somehow exposing my body and being very permeable to these toxic sites and trying to understand how sound can register toxicity. So how there's a sonic residue of toxicity and something that kind of lingers in time. Of course, I'm not an acoustician. I'm not analyzing like wavelengths, but I'm thinking of more kind of speculative, ontological, or philosophical ways of thinking with and through sound about bodies that have been under transformation. This is just an image for you to have a sense of the barges. So these boats were very common. They're very low. And here they're probably loading them with coal or other materials for construction or for energy. We had to canoe on the side lanes of the Mississippi because on the main lane, the water goes super fast. And the big, super tankers used to go on the main lane. So we had to occupy the side lanes to be a bit safer and sometimes do cross. And we had only one radio to communicate with the captains who were like, at all, what were we doing there? And what kind of, artistic or scientific research could we do, in those canoes? So there's a little bit of the contrast of the situatedness, curiosity that we had and the scale and scope of the industrialist project that we're just kind of inhabiting the peripheries of. This is a picture of my gear by lunchtime as we had breaks while we're rowing, all day rowing. And you get a sense. Now I'm recording a pond. And I can tell you that, for example, on this pond, I didn't hear much, but some engines on the background. And as I told you that sound travels 4 to 5 times faster underwater, you can actually listen to things that are happening at quite some distance. So an oil supertanker like the one you saw before, in open ocean, and depending on where the water column our microphone is, a supertanker can be heard 24 hours before it's seen because sound is traveling extremely fast in some parts of the water column. Here, my methods are a little bit more rustic than the military hydrophones. So I simply have my recorder capturing like the environment and below the water. I'm trying to listen if I find some species. As you know, there's a lot of Mississippi crawfish. They're small, kind of lobster-friendly creatures this size that are very tasty. And they would have like some, how do I call it? Some snapping sounds like. So most shrimps also have this kind of sounds, but I couldn't locate much. What I mostly heard, which I'm not playing today because Zoom is a bit tricky on sharing sounds, but you can imagine it and find some sounds online. I mostly hear boat engine sounds or pumping sounds from the water that is pumped to wash the cooling facilities of the refineries. And some boats maneuvering when they turn, sometimes you hear the frequency changing. You hear sounds that sound a little bit like metallic chains underwater, and lots of different engines at different kind of frequencies, lower frequencies, high pitch frequencies, and very kind of rhythmic, noisy kind of soundscape. Above the water, it's mostly like a kind of ongoing background noise, almost like this kind of industrial hum, and some stronger noises. And sometimes even the flares of the petrochemicals, they have such a sub bass. Once we camped at night, and it was hard to record with my mic, but the sub bass of this kind of oracular flame of the petrochemical was like really, really intense. So there are all these kind of industrial sounds on the atmosphere and below the water that I'm thinking and listening to. And at this point, I was kind of making some field notes and taking some of this kind of very kind of loose photograph of registering the traces that I find. This could be, for example, an alligator root or some snake roots on the sand. And I start to make some diagrams, as I'm very curious throughout my PhD research to understand the connection between sensory systems and how one can listen through an expanded body, like this kind of expanded river listening that feels the river and listens with and through the river as it's changing us through our body, as we're being kind of sunk, or how to say, as all these kind of chemical elements and entanglements travel through and around us, as liquid systems and as parts of the landscape, but also how sound doesn't happen only in our ears, but also, like, for example, in our vagus nerves, through our legs, through our abdomen, maybe even in our skull, depending where we are and where the sound exposure is. So I was trying to think in a very fluid way how sound is perceived and how sensing is actually, has to be conceived in such intermixed way, as Michel Serres used to say, that is really kind of this kind of kinetic negotiation of different senses that are kind of receiving these different kind of pulsations of the environment. So I'm thinking sensing, toxicity, and how our bodies are, being really permeable to this. At that moment, I'm also attending some courses when I go back to Portugal and continue my research remotely after 2 years. But I'm thinking a lot about non-human audition. And the image you see here is very special to me because you see these trees that have some kind of aerial roots. And I'm starting to think, what is a sensor? How does a body sense? And what kind of mechanisms does it develop to kind of adapt and register the transformations around it? We have to think that the Mississippi sometimes has a very, very high flux. So maybe these trees have adapted. So I'm very curious to think with and through this kind of possibility of sensing otherwise, and how other than humans also develop their own techniques, infrastructures, embodiments of sensing systems. We do know by now that plants listen, and there's many studies about that. They feel vibration. They have small hairs on their leaves that register vibration. They just listen otherwise, but frequency is there nonetheless. So I'm thinking here through those forms of adaptation and how, for example, Bernie Krause, an acoustician, speaks of the acoustic niche hypothesis that says that in a rich and mature ecosystem, no one species speaks over each other, but actually they adapt and find their own wavelength and chant and capacity to emit and to listen in these ecosystems. And I'm also thinking along, for example, feminist scholar Sarah Ahmed, that has a very beautiful passage on hearing as touch and how listening is actually an expanded way of encounter with the other, and how our skin or whatever membrane surrounds our body is actually a combination of those imprints of encounter with another. So I'm thinking of vibration in a much more expanded way. And being in this watery space around these creatures allows me to go further on some philosophical kind of investigation. That's the moment when, also due to my personal journey of healing, I'm very interested in Chinese medicine and in the concept of qi, which is the vital force. And after some conversations also in the Sensing Salon with Denise Ferreira de Silva, Valentina Desideri, and many other colleagues that also think about the planetary qi. So as an energy that goes from rivers through kidneys and through the planet again. And if we think about Standing Rock and the Water is Life movement, and maybe Sophie Lewis's text that is about amniotechnics and how, you know, the resistance of the body to the to dams and to the different forms of reproductive justice control is also a way of solidifying a life project that preserves the key, the vital energy that travels through feminine bodies, through the planet, and it goes, in a circular manner. So I started to do these diagrams and look at old Persian doctors, kind of schematics, and thinking about the nervous systems of our body and how they're all connected. And we're also like covered by the fascia. The fascia is like this kind of thin membrane around our body and muscles and joints that kind of is liquid and register all these kind of signals, and also how we have the electrical charge that is also traveling through those liquids that contributes to our metabolism. So after studying fish audition, so how fish listen, which is actually through a gas bladder on their belly, and also through lateral lines, so that's lines along their body that feel impending vibration. I was trying to think, if humans would listen in a very expanded way, how would they listen and register? What if we destabilize the listening as an auricular phenomena, but actually think of other ways of registering vibration, registering background noise, which is incremental in industrial areas, and really think of these entanglements of, the body environment industry, how the hydrogeological cycle is actually traveling through us in different signals, and how the river is a living strata, a living geological strata of impending sediments that travel. So I was thinking about all of these things and having conversations with people, of course, while traveling in the cancer alley. That's the main concern there is, endocrinological dysfunctions and how bodies are changing so much and how people have been resisting and living with cancer and around it. And I was thinking, in a place which has so much background noise 24/7, and where people are exposed to such chemicals that change also their hearing mechanisms and so on, can actually there be a connection between cancer and sound, between toxicity and sound? So this kind of sonic residue of toxicity. I had to think about this further when I went back to Portugal and went to study anatomy by myself. So I have to situate that I come from artistic studies. So I'm a generalist by all means. And artistic research allows us to tap into like different fields and find our curiosities to kind of solve these case studies or go deeper into them. And I won't bother you to go too deep into this diagram, but I had to go and pursue this kind of curiosity that I had of, can we actually listen of this alarmingly raise of background noise in the petrochemical corridor over in the last 150 years of industrialization, and also how it's been affected the body. Thinking about human body, but also other than human bodies. So I had to kind of go and understand the metabolic chains of toxicity and sound in and out. This to say, because in this area where plantations have been replaced by refineries, this is also an area where a lot of dispossessed communities live and are controlled by different kind of urban politics and zoning practices, and where the distribution of toxicity is clearly racialized, and where the mismanagement of the well-being of communities is, one has to say, quasi-deliberate, as an aftermath of slavery, as Christina Sharp has been writing about. So being conscious about being a fast traveler on a place which has a strong toxic heritage, but also a connection with very dispossessed communities that I've been fighting with and narrating this trauma for a long time. It's something that it was important to me, and on all the conversations we had, also when we landed in New Orleans and the workshops for 2 weeks, and like kind of been with more activists narrating their stories, it was very important for us to kind of really understand the distribution of toxicity around the river sites. And sometimes I played my recordings back to people. I was curious what they thought. And as I was experiment with, sensory ethnography in some way, and not knowing how or when I was doing anthropology of sound, I kind of was doing different methods at the same time. But I had the curiosity of like giving this experience of people of listening to the river with an hydrophone, because many of us haven't. So I also do some walks here in Lisbon and different kind of tactical meetings with activists or just common citizens to tell them about ecological transformations and open their sensory systems to perceiving deeply what's around them. And sometimes at night, after a long day canoeing, we played some of the recordings around the fireplace, and I took some notes and like had conversations about what people heard, and how the exposure to this continuous drumming drones of the engines was really something that impacted them. So I was very interested in like the relation also with other and with memory and sonic traces in people's bodies, and how it's kind of reliving some kind of sense of embodiment and connection to an ecosystem. Somebody who came on the journey before I did was theorist and activist Brian Holmes, who wrote an incredible text thinking about the river as a moving littoral. So much in line with Dilip Aquinas thinking about the invention of rivers, and that we inhabit different parts of the hydrological cycle. Brian Holmes is talking about, how we've tamed the capacity of the river to flow, and how that has been a political project since the beginning of settler colonialism, and how this moving littoral is controlled by different forms of contract, and even the engineering projects of the Army Corps of Engineers that are the ones responsible for the Mississippi flow and all the kind of diversions and new canals for petrochemical industry and infrastructures that sustain the river in its course today, and also protect people in the city, but not outside the levee system, so the dikes. So they do the water management. And they're the ones that kind of legislate this kind of capacity to flow. What has been called since the 1920s as flowage rights. Now that has been changed, but it's an interesting concept, because the flowage rights, they were contracts that the intensive agriculture kind of lobby signed to ask for the rights to flow, as in when the river course is really, really too high, and there has to be a decision of, what do we do so New Orleans is not flooded? And here you see, for example, an image of the Bonnicarrot spillway, which is a big spillway which is open and overfloods this terrain with water in case the river is too high. This is only every other year. This year, the river was so strong that it has been twice open. And these flowage rights are actually the thing that in early intensive agriculture, which is, of course, via nitrogen and corn, highly connected with the petrochemical infrastructure and complex. So there is a kind of a lobby of like where the water flows and who's allowed the right to flow in this kind of Foucauldian kind of biopolitical equation of let live or let die. And there's this memory, there's an acoustic memory of a levee that was dynamited, I think in the Great Flood many decades ago. Now I don't precise the numbers, so I'm not going to say a wrong number. But there was a moment when there was a great flood, and there was a decision by the Army Corps of Engineers to dynamite one of the protections, which actually flooded whole neighborhoods, and it was very complicated. So there's a kind of acoustic memory of this kind of terror of we could be, underwater again. And there's this kind of acoustic ghosts that permeates, how people live in and around water. almost in the kind of Apishapong Veresekatu's latest film shot in Bogota, where there's this kind of acoustic sound, this ghost that stays and changes people's inhabitations and their kind of sonic trauma. So here I'm interested in the relation between some sonic traumas, the dispossession of bodies in their sensory systems via high toxicity, and the impending kind of regime of the aftermath of slavery being like something that has transformed how also we've inhabited landscapes, how we do activism, and sound becomes my milieu to think through and around those toxic regimes. This is an image where I usually speak about the connection between engineering and evolution. The sediments that come rushing down the river, they actually get dredged at some points and sold back to enable people to do house foundations. So there's this kind of cyclical regurgitation of the geological cycle that the river does and that the industry profits from. That becomes also a way of allowing houses to be fixed, but becomes an endless market of coastal erosion and more sediments being displaced. And I'm very interested on how all these fluxes of engineering and evolution also change how species are adapting alongside them. And I had many conversations with theorists as I went back to Portugal, acousticians, ecologists, different researchers on some of these questions. How would they see that, for example, bird conservation was being thought through, or frog communication in this area in connection with climate change and the rise of industrialism, and how they could see that bodies were adapting in different ways. And I started thinking as well how sound was such an interesting and powerful tool to think about ongoing relations, ongoing power dynamics, and the idea of a kind of an impact, not only the endocrinological dysfunction, because that would be more human, but actually a shift on the metabolism of a body. And that sound is already provoking some of those impacts before they're fully expressed as a symptom. So the symptom would be cancer in the end, the fully enclosed diagnosis. But if we think of the temporality of toxicity, which has this kind of Rob Nixon called slow violence way of acting, in different temporal scales, and how sound is also operating, as a vehicle of those temporal scales, kind of interscalar. And it kind of stimulates us to think further, thinking about ecocide and climate grief, looking at environments and trying to analyze this kind of relation between, symptom and sign. Are the clouds we see the register of an ongoing, chemical change in the atmosphere? When will we see the fully developed system in a body that's been transformed by these ongoing relations? So this kind of diffuse temporalities of toxicity and sound is something that I've been thinking with and along in these aquatic spaces. And water becomes this kind of special milieu, that by destabilizing fixity and allowing me to have more kind of embodied contact with the river insights and with this kind of moving literals, I also think about the moving literals of sound in our bodies, in our expanded bodies. A traveler that I met in the end of the journey told me about her field recordings underwater, but not only, through the stretch of the Mississippi. Monica Haller was talking to me about a concept that she developed as imaginative listening. How can we listen to something which is out of sight, which is out of our range, but that we know that is still happening and is provoking some kind of transformation? So do we need to develop some kind of speculative form of listening that allow us to read the ecosystem differently and its relations, its kind of cumulative impacts or different sensory distributions in sensory systems and how they are kind of reacting to the impending changes. We're coming to the end of our journey, and I usually end with this picture from this aerial roots and the swamp to remind us, as Monica Haller says, that when we listen to the river, we actually listen to thick sounds, as if sound has this thickness of the sound that has been and will be, because there's this kind of compressed temporality that water has with the intensity of all the bandwidth layers and the memories and the past and futures and the different inhabitations of the swamps and the bayous and the many people that have been there, whose sometimes histories we cannot register, but that they still echo in the griefs and the transformations of the landscape around us. So we like to look at some of these watery landscapes and think of the thickness of sound and water, and how we can think deeper with it, not by solving any questions. And I have to say, my project being within the broad environmental humanities is not a kind of a scientific parcours that tries to justify I got through a certain objective of my research. I maybe had wider conversations, met a lot of activists, shared methodologies, also changed myself through listening and being exposed to toxicity, and that has changed my writing and my teaching. But I'm not saying that my research concludes something. It maybe opened up some acousticians' ways of listening to the world, or ecologists' complexity of questioning their own surroundings, but it just brought more questions instead of just straightforward results. And I guess I'll end here and take some questions and maybe stop sharing.
Wow, thank you so much, Margarida. This was beautiful and so rich. I'm thinking a lot about your methodologies and how I would love to hear more about it. But let's see if anyone has some question to ask. Please just raise your hand, open your mic if you do. Sandra is saying very inspiring. I totally agree with that. Does anyone have a question? Or while you think about a question to ask Margarida, because I imagine you are all processing these images and sounds and ideas, these concepts. I was thinking, Margarida, I never thought about this idea of geoengineering and the river as being defined by these structures. It's kind of obvious, but I never thought about it. And I love this kind of productive tension that I see with these structures in infrastructures, and your way of researching so intimate with the space and the land and the water, and with people also, because your listening is through some mechanisms, but also oral history and the museums. It's so many layers of approaching a subject that I love that, and would love to hear more about that that tension between the fixity of infrastructure and at the same time the fluidity of water, and your layered practices. But also, as I see, for instance, in your curatorial practice, you always have these multi-layered approaches that I would love to hear a bit more.
Maybe also as a disclaimer of sometimes the incapacity to research in a super professional way, even if this has been part of a PhD. I feel that my work is very granular in comparison to many other works that have been done in the Delta and in the Gulf, and the ongoing works of activists that have been there for like 20 years, 30, and whose battle is ongoing. So I feel like it's so granular, whatever I can add on an ontological way, or in a way of listening, or a methodology for a practice, for example, or for a workshop, which I try to develop and bring back to Portugal and take to rivers here. Because I should say this, that at some point during the research, lockdown hits, and I had to change to River Tejo. So I start in the estuary and then go upriver to Vila Velha de Rodão and the kind of eco side around Saltejo. So in a way, the whole thesis is against the idea of partition in natural systems and in life, is about life as a continuum that pours and flourishes, but is also on so much on environmental grief and on the ongoing grievances that we have in relation to the transformations around us. And for me, it was very important to have this, this kind of contrasting spaces, you know, the less industrialized space, the space which is maybe, you know, a bayou or a swamp, or then to go deeper next to the petrochemical and really talking about the militarization of nature. So have this exposure with my own body, as Srida Naimanis would also speak in her relation with toxicity and exposure of, you know, feminist and queer subjectivities in their own times to the different temporalities of toxicity, and how they're kind of occupying us, no, and controlling us. So I had, you know, in a way, a very kind of autoethnographic way of journeying through this context that I was opening and adapting to. And at the same time, you know, reading some policy papers and reports and doing the more kind of investigative critique of the power structures and infrastructures at place. So there was working or happening at different scales. It was important. Yeah. I don't know if I answered.
Yeah, you did. It's an ongoing conversation, I'm sure. But Sandra has a question in the chat.
Yes,
Sandra,
I do. Good afternoon,
Okay.
everyone. Boa tarde a todos e a todas. First of all, I wanted to ask to thank the organizers, Salomé, also for curating this. I came to this series of events completely by chance, but I knew anything that Salomé was involved would be good. So I know Salomé from our common times in Coimbra. I've been, I'm also a generalist, like Margarida was saying about herself. So I'm not an academic, but 99% of the people that are my close friends are researchers, poets, experimental poets, and also academics. So I'm very much involved in, you know, what's known as the eco-poetics movement. And you touched upon a theme that is quite dear to me, which actually I'm working on at the moment, which is memory. And also I wanted to say, you said your work was very granular. You might call it granular, but I'd say I can see right away, and I didn't know about your work, so pardon my ignorance, but it's granular, but it's expansive and it's generous and it's inspiring. So that's my perception. So I'm very interested in memory, and I wanted to ask, I was very much interested, you know, like the last part of your presentation, you were talking about the thickness of sound and what it can embody in terms of what used to be, what is, and what might become. That, at least that's how I processed it. So I wanted you to just expand a little bit on the memory part. I'm working on a project called Ocean Memory, with macro photography and drawing. But I wanted just to get, you know, some more inspiring doors of perception or rivers of perception about memory. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra, for your comment. Well, my answer starts with another disclaimer. Since I'm a generalist, I'm not a trauma studies or memory studies scholar, and that has to be quite forward. You know, my areas are more like toxic studies, ocean studies, and sound studies, somehow mixed. This conversation on the thickness of sound with Monica Haller, who's this fantastic sound artist from Minneapolis, actually from New Orleans, who moved upriver, because many people move downriver, and there's always these narratives of the different migrations. So she's actually now moving downriver again to seek this questioning of the thickness of sound and her own origin stories of her family that probably used to be former enslaved people. And there's a kind of very little remnants of their homes and where they were outside the levee system, so outside the big containing locks that protect from storms. There's this kind of more wild area with the houses on higher stilts and thick woods. You know, it's a very interesting place of marronage and different kind of estuaries. And in some of these encounters where we spoke about the thickness of sound, we're having conversations around the fire. And we're trying to connect with other dimensions and other forms of sensing temporal layers. I think New Orleans always brings this because it's a place that had so many forms of habitation. And as we know, some jazz rhythms started on Congo Square as a form of improvisation that developed in and around plantation music. So there's all this kind of multi-layered rhythmicity that one can listen still in the bars, but also listen back. And if one is sensitive to other forms of inhabitation and energetic lines, and we have to think that New Orleans has a huge presence of, voodoo culture and voodoo queens, and is a very important place for, this oral and oral story, And there's a lot of layers to this acoustic mapping of the city, which is in present tense, but also listens in time to past and future and tries to connect with those sounds that linger. So I think, I don't do it in my project, but we had a lot of conversations around it in workshops and practices of trying to develop like this kind of eco-conscious forms of acoustic listening exercises, even like blindfolded walks and other things, just trying to sense further or wider. So I think, and you have to think, to realize that I came from the Center for Research Architecture at Goldsmiths, which is forensically driven, data positivistic. And as soon as I enter, I was like, I want to encounter subjects from another point of view. And I want to think about testimonies from another channel. So in connection with memory and with truth claiming or evidence finding, I had to provide different methods or strategies to connect with memory, to connect with trace, to connect with the evidence. So yeah, I think memory is an interesting thing to think through and with, yeah.
Is there any other question?
I hope so.
I also loved when you talked about listening as touching, and every touch is always touching and being touched, and we see your own transformation through this journey, and so it's very sensible. I don't know, can you talk a bit more about this of listening as touching, and about also your poetry? You write poetry, did you say?
Yeah, I write poetry, and when they invited me for the journey, they were like, what are the tools you're going to take? And I'm like, for sure, my microphones and recorders, and I think poetry. And I was very shy about it, but I've been trying to develop, and became part of the writing. So such an important part of thinking deeper about ontological constructs. It's not the interview, it's actually the depthness of poetry, which is the most encrypted field notes sometimes, but that says so much about the ecological conundrums around us. So yeah, I just felt that it was such a complex site to register that poetry could bring another layer of registering it. Also knowing that there's an absence of acoustic studies, for example, or a lot of science done, because it's a highly militarized area. Who wants studies about this ecosystem? So maybe one has to have like counter tactics, and poetry became one of them. And the hearing as such, I'm not a Sarah Ahmed scholar, but I'm very fascinated about some passages where she talks about this kind of intersubjective space of communication. And if we think about air or water or toxicity even, how are we even regulating or allowing different forms of sensory communication? not only hearing, but sensing, no? And by allowing certain forms of toxic distribution and sensory dispossession, aren't we kind of abducting? So removing the capacity from some organisms or people, capacity to feel, to exist, you know? So I'm very interested in this kind of temporal equation. Here we are a bit abstract again, but thinking this kind of futurological capacity of fighting, actually from the restorative justice side, fighting against ideas of dispossession. So if we fight toxicity, you know, or if we reclaim a sensory like politics, we're actually reclaiming like life sprouting. So I'm trying to use some concepts from different authors, and hearing as touch would be one of those that thinks about the skin as a place of encounter, as a place that registers the different allowances and perceptions of the other. Yeah, this kind of epidermal membrane that registers change.
And it connects with this idea of restorative listening that you also address in a way. Can you explore that a bit more while we have some time yet?
I think I'm still developing that concept. So I'm not sure that it's fully, you know, I sometimes have the tendency of doing a lot of work, and in the end, I start to discover what I'm really writing about. And this can become like the book that I'm trying to transform my writing in. But when I try to think of restorative listening, one way of thinking about it would be what kinds of legislation and jurisdiction, but also protocols and mechanisms do we allow for listening, not only for us, but for others, that protect the listening of others, but also what kinds of circles of conversation and kind of hearing circles do we provide for activists that haven't been heard, like spaces for accountability through listens. Who listens through who? When the state's accountability to the toxicity, for example, of Celtejo has been completely dismissed, and, you know, the rights of the activists overturned, and even their sampling methods and so on. So who creates the protocols for listening and for allowing accountability through listening? So I think a restorative listening has to operate on different levels, and one of them has to be by allowing different modalities of convening through listening, through orality, through accountability, and also by allowing different kind of legislation and forms of protection around listening. So it's to have a more just relationship with orality.
Wonderful. So we're coming to a close. If there's no other questions, we'll be closing the session. It was amazing, Margarida. Thank you so much for sharing your work with us. And thank you everyone who joined us today. Join us also next week for the last session with Serpil Opperman. And thank you to Elena Mendoza and to Celina Braz, Contemporaneous team, for their support. Thank you everyone, and see you next week.
Thank you, Salomé. Bye.